I recently stumbled across a story that I'd like to share with you guys. It's told by Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper said that he was sitting backstage at the Grammys in 1974. And he's hanging out with John Lennon and Bernie Taupin. They're just sitting back and enjoying it and taking it all in. And Brian Wilson is there and kind of walking around. Now, this was a really dark period for Brian Wilson. He wasn't in the best place, and everybody knew he was struggling. So Brian Wilson walks up to Alice Cooper, and he says, "Hey, Alice, will you do me a favor?" He says, "Sure, what?" And he says, "Will you introduce me to John Lennon?" So Alice Cooper starts thinking to himself, how is it possible that these two giants have never met? How have they never crossed paths? They're two of the biggest bands in the world in the 60s, and somehow they've never met. And then he starts thinking, I'm going to be the person who actually introduces John Lennon and Brian Wilson. What an honor that is. So this is Alice Cooper. So I merely said, Brian Wilson, this is John Lennon. John Lennon, this is Brian Wilson. And Lennon was very cordial and polite, saying things like, "Hello, Brian. I've always wanted to meet you. I've always admired your work. Paul and I consider Pet Sounds one of the greatest albums ever made." And Brian thanked him and walked away, at which point Lennon went right back to his conversation like nothing had happened. Then Alice Cooper goes on and says, about 10 minutes later, Brian came by our table again, leaned down, and whispered something to Bernie. And all of a sudden, Bernie was saying, "Brian Wilson, this is John Lennon. John Lennon, this is Brian Wilson." Lennon was just as cordial and polite as the first time, saying essentially the same thing about always wanting to meet him. As soon as Brian walked away, John looked at both of us and casually said in his typical Liverpudlian accent, "I've met him hundreds of times. He's not well, you know." Alice goes on to say, "We were impressed by John's empathy and kindness in dealing with Brian, and thankful that Brian has found some mental stability following tumultuous times." I think that story shows John Lennon in a really good light. He handled that situation with kindness, empathy, patience. He handled it really well. But there's one problem with that story. I went looking for a primary source because I love Alice Cooper. He's a great storyteller. He's been up and down the road quite a few times. He's got quite a few great stories to tell. I thought maybe he told it on his radio show, but I went looking for where that story was originally from, and the only thing I could find online was the exact same story, copy and pasted everywhere, without a primary source. So I was a little bit worried about it. And a little time went by, and I just happened to pick up this book. It's Bernie Taupin's memoir, Scattershot, Life, Music, Elton, and Me. And as I'm reading through this is really great, by the way. This is really great. So reading through this, I just happened to come across that story. And he has a little bit of a different take on it, which I will get to in just a minute. But this book is one situation after another with famous people, amazing individuals, where he's just running into them left and right, Bernie Taupin. And really, really entertaining, fun book. There's a chapter called John Lennon's Not So Lost Weekend, where he shares a lot of stories about being around John Lennon. And Bernie Taupin says that he's sitting on a private plane. There's a couch on a private plane. So they're flying somewhere. He's sitting on this couch next to John Lennon. And they're in conversation about something. And John Lennon says to him, "I don't know if you've ever heard it before, but I wrote this song called Across the Universe." And he says he's kind of frozen, thinking, of course I've heard that song. Is he fooling with me? Is he joking? Or is he that humble where he thinks maybe I haven't heard this song? And Bernie Taupin says he completely forgot the context of what they were talking about because of that statement being so crazy, where John Lennon might not know or might think he doesn't know that song. So Bernie Taupin also talks about John Lennon agreeing to play with Elton John, get up on stage with him at Madison Square Garden. And John Lennon hadn't played live in a while. And Bernie Taupin says John Lennon is backstage throwing up in the toilet. He's vomiting because he's so nervous about going out and playing. John Lennon is that nervous. And he says he gets all sick, and then he sees him on the side of the stage getting ready to walk out, and he's holding his guitar, and he can see his hand holding the neck of the guitar, and it's shaking. It's John Lennon is this, afraid of going out. He's nervous. Afraid's the wrong word. He's nervous about it. So those of you who get nervous before you play, just realize even John Lennon dealt with that kind of stuff. But he walked out on stage. Everything was great. It was huge. They brought Bernie Taupin out on stage. And he says that's the last concert John Lennon ever played. The last time he got up and played for a crowd was that night. Somewhere down the road, Bernie Taupin goes to Los Angeles, and he meets up with John Lennon, and they're going to go see Bob Marley and the Wailers. They go and see the concert. It's great. Afterwards, there's a private party. He says at some point, Bob Marley walks in with the Wailers, and they're all just hanging out, and Bob Marley reaches into the back of his backpack and pulls out a joint the size of a baby's arm. And it was some of the strongest, craziest stuff he's ever witnessed. Go figure, Bob Marley would have the good stuff. So he said the last time that he ever got to hang out with John Lennon was just a few days later when they went to a party at Dean Martin's ex-wife's house. He said Dean Martin was still on good terms with his ex-wife, so it was widely known that he might show up to these parties, and everybody and their brother wanted to hang out with Dean Martin. So these parties would just be a who's who. So this is Bernie Taupin. He says it was all terribly Hollywood, with an array of current celebs and beautiful people relaxing. And as is always the norm at such events, the air of, quote, I belong, and, quote, I don't wish to seem impressed that John Lennon and David Bowie are mingling in my branded space was evident. So he goes on to say the party really wasn't that bad, and once you get past your own cynicism, you can have fun at such events. And this is Bernie Taupin. He says, that is, however, until the somewhat hefty presence of Brian Wilson plopped down beside me and whispered breathlessly into my ear, Bernie, will you introduce me to John Lennon? Okay, I'd met Brian on several occasions, and though we couldn't in any way be regarded as close friends, we were acquainted to the point of nodding acknowledgement and casual conversation. I was also convinced in this instant that there must most certainly have been some time in the not distant past that the Beatle and the Beach Boy had crossed paths. But then this was Brian Wilson circa 1975, the acid aftermath, the paranoia, the sandbox years. Still a lovely man, and in spite of being toasted by demons and lost in a fog of fragility, he was still someone to respect deeply and treat with tender, loving care. So naturally, I acquiesced and turned to John, relaying that Brian would like to say hello. And of course, he did gently and pleasantly, and with no hint of surprise at the request. They conversed briefly, and very soon John and I found ourselves in some other corner of the room where Brian found me and whispered once again into my ear that he'd like to meet John Lennon. Surprised but not terribly unprepared, given the individual at hand, I remained unfazed and once more turned to my party date, inquiring with a raised eyebrow if he would once more like to meet Brian Wilson. Similarly unruffled, but obviously amused, introductions were made, and small talk was made. Groundhog Day resumed, and not more than 10 minutes later, Brian, wide-eyed and insistent, waylaid me, pleading in no uncertain terms that he must be introduced to John Lennon. By this time, the hunter seemed transfixed on the game. It was as if they had never crossed paths, and that Brian needed the introduction like a junkie needed a fix. It was somewhat unnerving, but still harboring the same belief that the genius that was Brian Wilson was temporarily on vacation. What could I do? He says, 30 years later from the date in question, I sat alone in the studio with an engineer and watched as Brian Wilson stacked a 20-part harmony on our 2010 song, When Love Is Dying, with as little effort as it takes to blow smoke. What did he ask for in return? A really big hamburger. Yes, genius, unquestionably. And then he goes back to the night in L.A., slightly exhausted, but prepared to remain sympathetic. I approached John and ventured somewhat uncomfortably to once more relay Brian's request. Straight-faced and unwavering, John once more turned to engage the clearly overheated Beach Boy. Before long, he was back, and we made a beeline for the door rather than fall into the same trap for the fourth time. What did he want to talk about? I asked. John shook his head. Across the universe. So, sorry about that, I said. John looked at me, smiled, and in that unmistakable Liverpudlian drawl just said, bless him. He's not well, you know. That's Bernie Taupin from his book, Scattershot, Life, Music, Elton and Me. This is really, really good, folks, and you should pick up a copy of it. If you have a local bookstore, if you're lucky enough to have a mom and pop bookstore in your neighborhood or your town or whatever, please pick up a copy from them. If you don't have that, I'll put a link down below, and you can get a copy from that if you want to. But very, very enjoyable. I'd like to send a shout out to my buddy Ben Schaefer, who was involved in putting this together, a friend of mine from Indianapolis. I used to work the door at a bar with his brother Matt, and I love both of them dearly, and I'm very proud of them for both doing cool things in life. But you tell me, have you ever heard that story before? It sounds like maybe it wasn't a Grammy party like the Alice Cooper story said, but it was nice to get it confirmed that it actually happened. And I was very surprised when I was going through the book and found that, and really, really enjoyed that. I'm going to go ahead and put a link right up here to an interview that I did. You remember when the Beatles played on the roof and there was a redheaded kid holding John's lyrics and wrote in for them and such? It's Kevin Harrington, and I interviewed him. And I'm going to put a link to that up here, and you guys should watch that. It's very, very good stuff. And I will see you guys somewhere down the road. Much love to you.